Hello, everybody. I'm Marina Pugliese. I'm director at MUDEC and head of public art for the city of Milan. We now have a video from Tommaso Sacchi, Councillor of the Arts of the city of Milan.
Dear international guests, it is with great pleasure that I welcome speakers and guests from all over the world to the city of Milan as we gather here today for this prestigious international conference. This remarkable event is the result of a collaboration between MUDEC, Museo delle Culture di Milano, and the Getty Conservation Institute. And I thank you both institutions. The presence of a dedicated office within the municipal administration in Milan for public art lends immense significance to this collaboration, underscoring its intentional nature. The issues at stake are numerous, spanning from the conceptualization of new forms of public art to matters concerning its preservation, documentation, as well as alternative modes of commemoration and community engagement. So, by merging the Museum of Culture with the Office of Public Art under a single unique department, our aim is to surpass the boundaries of conventional museum settings and broaden our engagement to encompass the entirety of the city and its diverse communities. Milan's Office for Public Art has demonstrated remarkable dynamism in recent years, developing independent projects as well as supporting the realizations of projects with the city's residents. We recognize the imperative to evolve beyond a museum-centric perspective and embrace a more inclusive approach that responds to the evolving needs and inquiries of our diverse public. I am confident that this international gathering will serve as a platform for stimulating discourses and fostering innovative ideas, facilitated by the diverse array of professionals present, who will share their insights and exchange the best practices. I here extend, unfortunately only digitally, my heartfelt gratitude to the esteemed members of the Symposium Committee, Romy Crawford, Stavroula Golfomitsu, I'm sorry for the pronunciation, Tom Lerner, Austin Nevin, and of course Marina Pugliese. The distinguished speakers representing 15 nations, including our esteemed keynote speakers, as well as the dedicated staff of Getty and MUDEC Museum, whose efforts have been instrumental in bringing this symposium to fruition. Thank you all. I thank you, Marina. Thank you all the colleagues from all over the countries, and I wish you a very good stay in Milan.
Okay, and now I invite Stavroula Golfomitsu, my dear colleague, who promoted the idea for this symposium and who made it possible with the Getty Conservation Institute, her colleagues, and our colleagues at MUDEC.
Good morning, everyone. On behalf of the Getty Conservation Institute and MUDEC, I would like to welcome you all in this symposium. It is a great pleasure to see this symposium finally being materialized. And I say finally because the idea of this symposium started a few years ago in Sweden, where Austin Nevin and I were working at the University of Gothenburg. And as part of a small research project we looked into street and public art. And of course, at the time, the pandemic had started and we couldn't travel. And since we couldn't travel, we started doing these online panels. And some of you were present in those, some as panelists, some as audience. And we used these panels, actually, to tease out themes that we could explore further in a symposium or a conference. Since then, we have both moved to new positions. And the idea of the in-person meeting, of course, stayed with us, and this is where we are. My role at the Getty Conservation Institute is to look at collections, and public art collections are often overlooked or lack the right framework to be studied, promoted, and conserved. In all of its forms, as we know, public art is impactful, creates connections with communities and individuals, as well as nature, and instigates reactions from the public. It is common for an artwork to be despised, to be vandalized, or to be loved and adopted by a community, making sure it is cared for properly. We have a lot of inherited monuments, which need, of course, to be re-examined and discussed under a new light. And Hamza Walker later today will give us a taster of such monuments. We know that cities evolve, and with the cities, of course, the communities evolve and expand, and we need to question what we keep and what we let go to allow space for new art expressions to be created and enjoyed, but also how to memorialize what will not last because of its ephemeral nature. A central question for us remains how we can work better with communities to preserve what it is valued. And of course, Marilyn Douala-Bell and Marta Pucciarelli tomorrow will touch upon this. These 2 days are focused on different aspects of public art, and they will be discussed over sessions, which, as you will see, overlap to a large extent. And we hope at the end of the symposium, we will have a great synthesis of all these discussions that could generate new ideas for work. With the speakers and with your help, we will discuss where we are and where we need to go, hoping to find connecting points and forge new relationships and collaborations. The format of the symposium is designed to promote exchange of ideas between the panelists of the different sessions and all of us. In each panel, there will be short 10-minute presentations by the speakers, followed by a moderated discussion, and then questions from the audience. The presentations are live streamed for our colleagues who couldn't join us in Milan. And I would like to thank Marina Pugliese, who has been a great partner in this, and MUDEC for co-organizing the symposium. Milan's focus and investment on public art is a great example for other cities, and it was a great and a natural partner for us. I would like also now to invite the members of the organizing committee, and Romy, Tom, if you can come, Austin and Marina. And without them, of course, none of this would have been possible. And I hope that you will find them during the breaks or the reception and talk to them. Each one has worked on public art from a different perspective. Marina as a director of MUDEC and head of public art in Milan. Austin as professor of conservation who has worked a lot on wall paintings. Romy as professor and with a great work on public art. And Tom as head of science at the Getty Conservation Institute and contemporary art expert. And finally, I would like to thank our colleagues at the Getty Conservation Institute, Naomi Mayo, who is here, Rim Barudi, and many other Getty colleagues, some of them here as well, or online, and MUDEC colleagues, Alessandro Oldani, Alice Cosmai, and Franca Farago, without whom we couldn't plan this symposium. So thank you all very much and welcome, and I hope that we will have a great 2 days. And Marina is next. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vula. Just a few words to explain you what's the relationship between public art and a museum. So basically, we believe that museums have a better chance to penetrate the urban context and get in touch with the communities through public art. On the other hand, we also believe that public art is a complex context, multi-layered, and could benefit from the knowledge that a museum can provide. This symposium is part of an exhibition. It should have been this one. The Symposium is part of an exhibition, exposure, art, cultures, fashion in and out of the showcase, which focuses on the symbolic and practical meanings and values that the vitrine add to the artworks in a museum context. And of course, the plinth, the pedestal, is a counterpart of the vitrine in the context of public art. So that's why this symposium inside under the umbrella of the exhibition. On the right, you can see the magazine that we publish. We don't publish a book, we don't publish catalogs, we publish a magazine because this allows us to enlarge the themes we focus. So in this case, it is about display. The exhibition is curated by Katia Inozetseva. You will hear her later today moderating the panel, the artists panel. And getting back to Castillo de Bal, which you can see, you have seen in the museum hall. It's one of the 3 contemporary art productions that we did on the occasion of the exhibition. The second is by Theo Eshetu. We asked Theo to reread our collections. And finally, to Monia Ben Hamouda, we asked her how to go out, to go beyond the museum vitrine, which is, of course, a Western tool. And getting deeper into our public art research and production, this is the park you will be able to visit tomorrow, Artline. Probably one of the biggest production ever made in Italy, 19 works of art. It will be completed and inaugurated next October. Here you can see 2 works by Pascal Martin Tajou and Maurizio Nannucci. It was curated by Roberto Pinto. He will be with us tomorrow, Riccardo Benassi and Alfredo Jar, but many other artworks by Jeremy Deller, Liliana Moro, Otto Bonganga. And then mural pieces. We have an ongoing project which is called A Name for Every Neighborhood. We have 88 neighborhoods in Milan. We have already produced around 20-25 artworks. The idea is that together with the communities, with the schools, with the universities, with the cultural centers, we identify the name and a mural piece in a landmark position which will, again, identify that neighborhood. But we also work on more ephemeral productions, such as poster art or temporary installation, and we are thinking, we are cogitating on the idea of sustainability, so we're thinking on scalable and replicable work of art. Last but not least, we work a lot on memory, and thinking of producing a memorial for the victims of the Italian colonization. There's no memorial in Italy at the moment yet. We also decided to get deeper into the history of the memories of colonization in our streets and squares, and so we did this digital map, which will be enriched in the future with the collaboration of the communities. I don't want to repeat myself because Vula already made all the names, but of course this wouldn't have been possible without the hard work of our colleagues at Getty and at MUDEC. Yeah, we recuperated 5 minutes, which is good. So let me introduce our first speaker, Lewis Biggs. Lewis is an independent curator, formerly director at Tate Liverpool. He co-founded Liverpool Biennial. He is chairman of the Institute for Public Art, a global network of researchers concerned with place creation through art-led urbanism. Thank you, Lewis.
Good morning, and thank you so much for inviting me. It's a great honor to be with you this morning digitally. I'm so sorry not to be with you in person because there were so many conversations I want to have with so many people. Could you put up the first slide, please? Thank you. So this slide is of green fields between Folkestone and Ashford. This is in Kent, in the corner of the UK between London and the Channel. And our government has asked every local government to look at housing possibilities, to build more houses. And the local government in this part of Kent has proposed a greenfield site with a a new town to be built on these green fields. The only distinguishing feature you can see in this slide towards nearly on the horizon, towards the right, there is a tower, if you can see it. This is a tower remaining from a horse racing course. So the main historical feature, recent historical feature of this site is that there was a race course for horses. Next slide, please. As you know, new towns have a mixed reputation, and so it's not always easy to attract people to go and live in a new town. Particularly at the beginning, a new town very often doesn't have schools or any public facilities, and although these are planned, the local authority and local government, as developer, takes its marketing very seriously and wants to market this new town to creative people and to people who enjoy the countryside. I mean, these are the unique selling points, they believe, of this particular site. And so it's not a huge jump from there to invite an arts organization, Creative Folkestone, and me, to become involved in planning this new town. For me, this is a dream come true. I've waited my whole life to be involved with planning a new town. But there are some features. This is a map that was drawn by Farrell's, the master planners, maybe now 6 or 7 years ago, to show some of the features that are already on the site. You can see, first of all, the site is about 3 kilometers from one side to the other. At the top, there is a road and a railway, which are very important for the connectivity of the site. And you can see there is two-thirds towards the right of the slide. You can see a dotted line moving north-south. This is a Roman road, Stone Street, which ran from the Roman port of Lim, which is now on dry land, to Canterbury. So there are historic features. In the top third of the slide, you can see a blue pond, which it's in fact a lake, which was in the middle of the race course. And also near the top of the slide, there is a castle, Western Hanger Castle, which was a hunting lodge belonging to Henry VIII. So that's the main historic draw for people to come to this site. And we are told by the government department responsible for heritage that heritage adds to the value of your life by approximately £650 a year. I'm very happy to know that. Very important is that the water, the water moves from right to left, from east to west on this site. And I'm coming back to the importance of water in a moment. So this is the master plan showing where the housing is going to go. There are going to be 10,000 new homes in the first phase and rising to 15,000 new homes over 20 years. The planning started in 2016 when the local government bought some of the land, and it would have been great to be involved to be able to involve artists with the master planners, but unfortunately that didn't happen. However, it's great that we have been able to start introducing artists to the master planning team before the master plan is implemented. So now, as you know, we are celebrating nature in this section of the conference, and the sculpture that I'm about to talk about is a celebration of water. Water is fundamental to all human settlement as well as to nature, of course. And before roads or houses or any other infrastructure is built for a settlement, we have to consider the water, how the water supply will take place, how the water drainage will take place. And there is an enormous, those of you involved with planning know there is an enormous amount of regulation around new buildings and how to deal with water runoff produced by new hard surfaces. But apart from these technical considerations, we know also that people residents, the eventual residents of the site, will be happier if they can see water. I mean, water makes people happy, we know this. And it also increases the value of property, because people are happier living where they can see water or know that there is water there. So the opportunity to make water visible is the brief that I went to an artist with, Chris Drury, who's been involved with ecological art for now since the 1970s, very knowledgeable and eminent artists in this field. And I asked Chris Drury to work with the engineers to make water visible, because engineers have a habit of putting water underground where we can't see it, but it's much more interesting if we can. Chris Drury, next slide, please. Chris Drury chose the totemic presence of an otter to thematize his sculptural intervention, simply because there is an otter in the title of the new town, which is going to be called Otterpoo Park, and so it makes sense for him to work with the otter as a totemic presence. This slide is the sculpture is divided. The sculpture runs from one side of the site to the other, so it's a 3-kilometer long sculpture, but it's divided into 4 sections, and I'm going to talk very quickly about the 4 sections. This is the first section. You can see the castle, the historic castle at the top of the slide, and this curving line is going to be an earthwork ending in a kind of vortex pool. Next slide, please. So this is Chris's drawing of the same part of the territory, and the next one, please. This is another perspective on the same sculpture, and here is yet another drawing of the same piece. Next one, please. The next part of the sculpture is called Otter Rise, and it consists of 2 concentric circles, in one of which there is a stone circle and the other has a boardwalk running across it. Now these ditches, of course, fulfill some of the regulatory demands made on the development, because wetlands and the provision of habitat for the animals which are displaced by the building are an important part of satisfying the regulations surrounding the new town. Next slide, please. This is Chris's drawing of the same part of the sculpture, and the next one. Otter Meat is the 3rd part of the sculpture. Next slide, please. And is cited on, well, these are footpaths. The dark green lines are footpaths, which and the sculpture follows the footpath. Where it says slate line circle this is the sculpture, and it's your viewpoint is directed towards the castle. If you stand in the middle of the site, your viewpoint will be directed towards the castle. Next slide, please. And the fourth and most ambitious part of the sculpture. Next, please. We've missed a map, but don't worry. This is at the western end of the site, is where the water treatment works are going to have to be, and the water treatment, the outflow from the water treatment plants has to go through reed beds, and so this is Chris's design for reed beds. In the middle of these reed beds, there will be a mound built for people to observe what's going on in the reed beds, and the scale is huge, as you can see. So this is as far as we've got. Can you pause here for a moment? Chris's plans have gone now to the architects and the landscape designers, and they are responding with more detailed planning as to how to put this sculpture into, how to manifest the sculpture. And I should say at this point, if you're wondering how much all of this costs, the engineering has to be done in any case. There is no way they can avoid moving a large amount of earth around. And moving earth around is expensive. But it doesn't make much difference to the expense if you make something beautiful with it. You can make some very dull ponds, or you can make a beautiful serpentine sculpture. The cost is not so different. And so the teams who are working with Chris are delighted to be involved in something that's a bit different and something which is not going to prevent them, but is going to fulfill their ambitions for the site. So that's what I wanted to share with you this morning. Thank you so much for listening. I hope I've come in on time. And I look forward very much to talking more about the context when we have the panel discussion at a later time.
Thank you so much, Lewis. And I now invite Oscar Svanelid. Oscar is a postdoctoral researcher in art history at Sodertorn University in Stockholm. His research focuses on the role of public art in the Nordic cultural model, particularly in restricted spaces such as military facilities and prisons. Welcome, Oscar.
Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's an honor. And as you say, I will present or share some of the results and reflections from a research project where I'm now focusing on the role of public art or permanent works of art that's been commissioned for the Swedish military. And of course, I'm aware that art in military facilities, which, as you imagine, is often quite restricted areas, are not aligned with a more traditional definition of public art that would require a more sense of accessibility and visibility and so on. But, I mean, military sites have indeed been very significant, I would say, for the development of public art as a field in Sweden and across the Nordic countries. And it started the research really when I started looking at the numbers, because since the 1930s, the Swedish state has commissioned around 2,000 permanent artworks for state institutions and agencies, and along with some non-governmental sites. And this has been done through this cultural organization, which is state-owned, which is called Public Art Agency. And in fact, it's only the university sector that has kind of received more public art commissions than the armed forces. So this has turned military facilities like regiments or bases and military schools into kind of key sites for distributing modern and contemporary art outside of museums. So I would say this is quite an unexpected outcome of the kind of culture policy or project of the Swedish welfare state, which has been aiming at making art accessible to all, but then it's good to be a student or a soldier to actually access it. And by just linking this up to the theme of this session, which is soft power, and of course the arts and culture can be viewed as a form of soft power, then would kind of contrast with the hard power of the military. But what I'm interested in to see what role public art or art could play within government agencies associated with hard power, such as the military. And from the perspective of Sweden, then, can we say that art has only been concerned with, making military facilities more attractive, more kind of aesthetically pleasing, which would follow from the more standard definition of of soft power, or could they be seen as having a more critical edge? And So in my research, where I've gone through these more than 200 works, kind of coding them visually, I found that works with this kind of military and patriotic contents like battle scenes or portraits of officers or kings and this type are in fact very rare. So Swedish soldiers are much more likely to encounter artworks featuring this kind of more peaceful, non-aggressive content, which could be conveyed with different means. It can be this kind of, landscape paintings as a kind of tranquil dwelling places, and it can be the inclusion of kind of peace doves, or this kind of more kitschy, heterosexual love scenes. So this indicates then that art has been, of course, instrumentalized, but along a different path and with a different purpose than, glorifying military power or honoring national pride. And I would like to go on to one of many examples for how art has tried to kind of soften the military environment. And this is a series of acrylic paintings by the feminist collective Sappho's döttrar, the daughters of Sappho, which was commissioned for the Swedish Air Force in the 80s. And it has a long and I think quite cute title, as you see. It's The Spirals of Galaxies Resemble the Tuft of Hair on a Baby's Head. And as I think you perhaps see, I don't know if it's a bit cut there, but it kind of contrasts the military aircraft stored in the hangar here with these images of female figures, we were seeing, and male figures and some kind of non-gendered figures in this intimate connection with birds, with flowers and celestial bodies. So this is a way this work can be seen as this kind of gendered critical engagement with the military site, where human figures are engaged in decidedly non-aggressive, non-military relationships. And I think, of course, the watermelons here can also be seen as a symbol for Palestine and solidarity. So this is just one example of many where art has been used as an instrument for kind of bringing the soldiers to their senses, so to speak, kind of train them in their feelings of empathy and compassion for other beings. And of course, as it has tried to function as a tool doesn't mean that it has worked this way, but this is not part of my research. But what about the edges of critique? And of course, we must understand that the aesthetics of the military, of course, is a very regulated field. On the other hand, we have Swedish culture policy that kind of values the freedom of art, and the Public Art Agency has been there to as well honoring the freedom of art. And but in reality, when you look at the commissioning process, of course, the relationship between art and state is more complex. So this war painting by Swedish artist Mamma Andersson was recently sent back by the Ministry of Defense in Stockholm after the installation of the new right-wing and nationalist government, who viewed it as too strong, and also considered, or they said that it would stole attention from the kind of issues that they were to be discussed within the Ministry of Defense, which of course is one way of saying that that work actually kind of worked. And the working committees that has represented military sites have also micromanaged, not always, but sometimes, the artworks created for their facilities. So this is a sketch of what would become a stucco lustro painting. And as you see, it kind of features this underwater view. And it was accepted by the Swedish Navy, but on the condition that it only contained fish species that was kind of native or indigenous to the Baltic Sea. So it kind of highlights how military control kind of extends into the realm of art, which then, of course, in this case is kind of defended against intrusion of any foreign or invasive species. And in the rare cases where artists have tried to be more edgy, their sketches have quickly and sharply been shut down by the military representatives. So this is one example of from the 1980s as well. The Swedish artist Stefan Telemann submitted a sketch for a triptych. This is the central panel, for the entrance of a military school in northern Sweden. And he presented his caricature of a military officer, which you see on the star there, which has this, I don't know if you see, this kind of gauntlets. It's reminiscent of those worn by a famous Swedish king who was killed in battle. And of course, he has kind of his testicles hanging out and his forms of heads and so on. So, and of course, this was not accepted. Okay, art can be trying to soften this our environment, but no, this is where we draw the limit. So just to finish off where we stand now, I think, before a kind of uncertain future, of course, all over the world, but in Sweden as well, and from this particular point within the art commission for the Swedish military. So, as you have seen, this kind of is based on this Nordic culture model where public art is seen as a tool for promoting culture, democratic values to everyone, including soldiers, police officers, and so on. And then this idea of artworks as actively engaged in managing the kind of sentiments of governmental agencies, kind of educating the senses of the soldiers, as we have seen. And then we also had this Swedish neutrality policy, which is coming to an end. And the goal of the neutrality policy during the Cold War was, of course, to form this consensus on Sweden as this kind of forerunner of a peaceful modernity, which was perhaps not completely false, but a simplified view overlooking various aspects. And then public art as this tool for advancing and deepening the aesthetics of neutrality, not only within the general population, but also turning inwards towards the soldiers. So in the New Horizon, we have, of course, the repoliticization of culture policies, the end of consensus. Sweden has entered NATO. We have the influence of kind of far-right populism within the government, and this kind of idea of art as a strengthening national identity. So will this lead to the end of state-commissioned critique? So are we to say, finally, farewell to the kind of welfare vision of public art as, a mean of cultural diplomacy turned inwards? Or will we see a kind of future development or even radicalization of this idea and this cultural heritage? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Oscar. And I invite Elisabeth del Prete. Elisabeth is Senior Curator at UP Projects and Associate Lecturer at the Royal College of Art. Her research explores socio-political issues through collaborative and regenerative art practices. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Marina, and thank you for inviting me here. I'm here bringing together both my research developed independently and research developed with UP projects. UP projects is a public arts commissioning body based in London and active UK-wide. We are a national portfolio organization and a charity, which means that we receive regular funding from the Arts Council of England. Our work in the public domain connects communities, shapes identities, empowers inclusion, and addresses the most pressing issues of our time. So the question that I pose here today is, can public art help test new democracies? What are the conditions that bring people together? How can creative engagement with communities be an opportunity to acknowledge hierarchies and instill a sense of agency by testing new decision-making processes? But first, I would like to start with the word democracy. As many of us know already, the etymology of democracy comes from ancient Greek. Demos and kratos. Demos is people, publics, and kratos is rule, power. The focus on the two words is particularly useful as these are complex and nuanced terms that are often referred to in public art. Demos, the people, or rather the public. Are we talking about the public or a public? What is the difference between the two? Public is often used in reference to words such as realm, sphere, context, space. And when talking about public space, are we talking about publicly accessible space or publicly owned? Moving on to kratos, power. What is the difference between power and empowerment? And this is something that I'd like to explore in a bit more depth during the panel discussion. Is power something that needs to be eliminated? Or rather, something that needs to be acknowledged? Because only once it's acknowledged, it can be distributed democratically. So how does all of this link to public art or social practice? I'm interested in the ways in which democratic models can offer creative practitioners and communities the opportunity to test new creative methodologies. Democracy has evolved since 507 BC, when it was first introduced in ancient Athens, and there have, of course, been many iterations. When we talk about democracy, do we mean representative democracy or participatory democracy? Obviously, as in many Western countries and beyond, in representative democracy, we elect representatives in government to make decisions on our behalf and to represent our best interests. Whereas in direct or participatory democracies, citizens engage in crucial decisions, using tools to design the decision-making process, brainstorm idea, vote, decide which project to fund or to work on or to deliver, etc. So I'm interested in the parallels that can be drawn between socially engaged art project and practice and the tools used in participatory democracy, which manifests in many of these projects, participatory budgeting, whereby citizens gather to allocate budgets and resources to specific projects, participatory policy making, juries and assemblies, and legislative theatre. The art project where these parallels become more apparent are the ones that create the conditions to advance democratic practice. And this is through building capacity. So is the project developing the community's ability to be self-determining, to reveal and express their views and identities? To define terms of collaboration. Is the project using consultation? Is it using creative engagement? Or is it using co-creation? What is the difference between the three, which usually comes down to the level of agency that community members have? Start with trusts. What are the processes that creative practitioners, curators put in place to build that trust with community groups? Adopt conflict as care, so see the other not as an enemy, but as an adversary, a legitimate adversary. Add value. How can activities specifically designed to generate value for everyone? So I wanted to share two projects at this stage that are initiated and curated by Art Projects, which connects with these principles. I guess I wanted to mention that they don't bring together all of these principles at once, but can be connected with some of them. The first is Gut Feelings Marie-Jeanne by artists Jasleen Kaur, who has just been nominated for Turner Prize, by the way. And Gut Feelings Marie-Jeanne was commissioned by Art Projects in partnership with Touchstones in Rochdale. Rochdale was an industrial centre in the north of England. And in the last century experienced high levels of migration. This project began in 2017, and the final outcome was presented in 2021, 2022, as an exhibition, but also as a 2-day film trail in various locations, including community centers. But the aspect about these projects that I wanted to bring your attention to is, was Jasline's relationship with a group of women and gender non-conforming people from Rochdale's Asian communities. And the question that Jasline asked the group was, what do we find when we go looking for ourselves in the archives? How can we alter the course of history through a new script? So this project very much involved sharing hardship along the way, vulnerability. In fact, it happened during COVID, which inevitably helped build trust. The group, in fact, often talks about the engagement process as a safe space. Another key concern for Jasline was, how does agency and power stay in the group beyond the length of the project? Should the group continue to meet beyond the funding cycle? And how can her role become less visible after the project has ended? And equally, there was a lot of self-reflection around the relationship between these discussions, the engagement with the community group, and the final artwork by Jasline. And in fact, the artist talks openly about the responsibility she felt inviting the group on this journey. Another project, yeah, these are other images from the film still that Jasline Kaur developed together with the group. And another project, the last that I wanted to bring your attention to, is Constellations. That very much like this conference is a learning exercise. It's a learning and development program for artists, curators, creative practitioners that operate in what we call the expanded field of public art. It's curated by Up Project in partnership with Liverpool Biennial, Flat Time House, and Devon Project. And what's crucial about Constellations is that it acknowledges that working with community groups involves, is it here? Yeah. Involves negotiating between creating innovation and social impact. How do you find the balance? Often working with community groups involve risks. So how do you find the conditions to actually advance your creative practice and test new models? So this is what Constellations really is about, creating that opportunity for practitioners to not only attend online events, but also take part in workshops, seminars, or mentoring sessions to negotiate the challenges of working in the public realm. Thank you very much.
I'm now inviting Fang-Tze. Fang-Tze is a curator at the Singapore Art Museum. Her research explores sonic modernity, Cold War aesthetics, and the intersection of critical curatorial historiography with a decolonial pedagogical approach. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me. So, in the following presentation, I would like to share the public sculpture initiative by ASEAN in 1980s and focusing on its inaugural edition in Singapore in 1981. For those who are not aware, the ASEAN stands for the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. By revisiting the inaugural ASEAN Sculpture Garden at Fort Canning Hill in Singapore, I would like to engage with the following questions. What capacity might public sculpture possess in the realm of cultural diplomacy? How might art historical discourse on art in public space provide a critical reflection on Southeast Asia's regional characteristic extend beyond the ASEAN framework? The Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, was established in 1967 with its 5 founding countries, including Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Singapore, and Thailand. According to Donald Weatherby, a prominent international relationship scholar who specializes in Southeast Asia, he indicates ASEAN calls for greater and more effective collaboration especially in Southeast Asia, and including agriculture industry, the most importantly, the expansion of the trade, end quote. Initially, the organization aims to promote collaboration in various fields, including culture, but the role of culture in ASEAN was not formally recognized until the establishment of ASEAN Committee on Culture and Information, short form as ASEAN COSI, in 1978. The ASEAN COSI was created to foster cultural cooperation among member nations. An inaugural ASEAN Sculpture Garden at Fort Canning Hill in Singapore holds significant historical importance as a result. Singapore became the first host of ASEAN Sculpture Symposium in 1981. Following this, the ASEAN Sculpture Garden was established in Singapore in 1982. The 4 other cities also opened their sculpture garden in the following order: Bangkok, Thailand, 1983, Jakarta, Indonesia, 1984, Bandar Seri Begawan, Brunei, which joined ASEAN in 1984, also had this sculpture garden in 1986, and Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, 1987. The Philippines, due to its political turmoil, had a chance to have its ASEAN sculpture garden. Although the funding resource was not specified in any official documentations, Japan government's financial contribution to the project were mentioned in several news reportages. The ASEAN Sculpture Symposium was inaugurated by the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Culture of Singapore on April 1st, 1981, with an opening speech that provides an overview of the events. In it, the minister called the project both, quote-unquote, a challenge and an exciting prospect, end quote. To put it more precisely, the role of art and culture is to promote unity within ASEAN. The ASEAN Sculpture Garden in Singapore reflects this effort. Despite the diversity in terms of ethnic culture backgrounds of ASEAN member countries and their historical hostility towards one another, artists have been charged with exploring common ground in this particular case. There are 5 sculptures in the first edition of ASEAN Sculpture Garden in Singapore. Mechtild from Indonesia with the sculpture titled Unity. Malaysian artist Afenli Muhammad Ismail with a sculpture titled Tamasari. A Singapore artist Andean with the sculpture titled Balance. The Thai artist Vija Sidilantian with a sculpture titled Concentration. The Filipino artist Napoleon Abuveda with the sculpture titled Fodies Viende. The 5 sculptures symbolize a collaborative cultural diplomacy initiative that seeks to enhance mutual understanding and trust through cultural exchange programs. At the same time, each artwork can be viewed as an individual interpretation of ASEAN's unity and identity from artistic, unique perspective. It is also worth noting that the potential gap between the sculptors' artistic message and their public presentation may offer indicated insight into the operation of a soft power in this particular case. For instance, Malaysian artist Afenli Muhammad Islam's sculpture Tamasari was unfortunately replaced due to its use of fiberglass, which couldn't withstand the erosion caused by the heat and rain in Singapore. Despite this, Tamasari was a contemporary interpretation of the legendary weaponry created by Honto, a warrior from the Malay annals. The work reinforced its narrative through the form and the title, which shaped similarly to a cross handle, suggesting the imagery of warrior history shared by Malay-speaking community alone in Archipelago. However, the replacement of Tamasari by Anthony Lau's sculpture augury leads to a controversial, was seen as a symbol of Chinese supremacy in Singapore in this particular context. Song Baoqing, a prominent figure in Singapore literature circle and assistant director at the Ministry of Culture, spearhead the initiative. Governmental archive reveals that Song's proposal for the ASEAN Sculpture Garden was inspired by the 1977 Commonwealth Games held in Canada. Additionally, Song's connection in art and culture scene garnered extensive coverage of this particular event. For instance, Singa, which is shown on the slides, Literature and Art in Singapore, a publication which Song was also seated at the editorial board, feature a special edition on the ASEAN Sculpture Garden in 1982. However, Kang Youming's article, A Boost for Sculpture, was published in the art column of New Nation on May 15, 1981, and it provides the first-hand account of the inaugural sculpture symposium from Song Baoqing, the reading convener of the project. The article was also includes two critical responses from the art scene in Singapore. Namely, brother Joseph McNally and T.K. Sababati. Unlike most of the news articles that celebrate the first sculpture symposium in Singapore, Kang's writing introduced a question into the discourse about the potential domestic benefits for the advancement of sculpture art in Singapore. Sababati questioned the deployment of sculpture art in the diplomacy initiative, but his comment underscored the importance of site specificity by stressing the need to carefully plan a specific sculpture for a specific area. T.K. Sababati expanded upon his comment on Kang's inquiry by examining the meaning of the public. A Singaporean art historian known for his commitment to quote-unquote regionalist approach when writing about art history of Southeast Asia and his pioneer writing on modern sculpture in Malaysia and Singapore. Sababati began his discussion by posing a set of questions about the first ASEAN Sculpture Garden in this article titled New Lamps for All, Public Sculpture and the Public. This question focusing on the relationship between art and public, the expectations and anxiety generated by public sculpture, and how such art affects the environment. Sababati's critique goes beyond the traditional dichotomy between the work of art and its viewer, or a sculpture and its public. Instead, he proposed a deep history that triangulates the meaning of the term region through a continuation of geographical area, a culture of symbolism without clouds, and a collective confidence in art to form the public. To conclude, Singapore's ASEAN Sculpture Garden represents ASEAN's commitment to foster cultural cooperation and appreciation among its membership countries. As a symbol of cultural diplomacy, it utilized art and culture to promote unity, respect diversity, and strengthen shared regional identity. However, with regional cultural practice evolve rapidly due to the modernization and a pursuit of artistic autonomy, concerns about site specificity and critical examine regionality beyond political and economic boundary persist and continues emerge, as exemplified by the recent commission also by ASEAN Cultural Foundation, Singapore artist Fairul Dharma's sonic response to the site of ASEAN Sculpture Garden re-examine this particular unfortunate neglection of the site of history, which is actually a holy land for Malay community in Singapore. I'm just going to clip to showcase a little bit of this particular piece and also show the contemporary look of the ASEAN Sculpture Garden. Thank you for your attention. Meanwhile, you can also click the link if you want to find out more about this particular initiative across Southeast Asia. Thank you.
And then our last panelist for this first panel on policy and soft power, Mechtild Widrich. She's professor of art history, theory and criticism at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Her research focuses on art in public space, performative interactions, and monuments. Welcome, Mechtild.
Thank you so much for the invitation. Very happy to be here. All right. I will today talk about recontextualization or contextualization of existing or problematic artworks. I will work with just one example in Vienna, and I would like to problematize, I think, the concept of contextualization as an easy way out. So what I will be arguing is that we need to focus not just on the artistic intervention, but on the contextualization and recontextualization of activists, administrators, and preservationists. So the case study is simple enough. It is a monument in Vienna. It's the monument to an anti-Semitic mayor around 1900, Karl Lueger. It stands on a square that still also bears his name. Lueger was the big idol for Adolf Hitler, who learned his populist anti-Semitism from this person. So the statue and the monument have been discussed for decades, but in 2023, the city of Vienna launched a closed competition and, surprisingly to many, announced the winner as being Clemens Willidar, with a tilt of the whole statue, which was actually a project he had submitted 10 years earlier for a competition that had been launched by the Art Academy. As you see, the monument had been recontextualized already by activists through graffiti. Schande means shame, and it had also become a meeting place for neo-fascists in the recent years and for counter-activists to the statue. So I will treat the proposed tilting of the monument, which could be seen as a compromise typical of Vienna, like having their cake and eating it too, in a broader discussion around the contextualization of existing public art, in particular traditional monuments. So the conference today allows me to think about conservation care and the question of the roles of administrators and artists and audiences, and think about a public space that people care about, that in return needs to be cared for. So conservation regulations played a prominent role in the call for proposals, and full disclosure, I was not in the jury, but I was on the expert committee that wrote the call for the proposals. And so the monument is under protection, and the reason is that in the legal situation in Austria, a monument cannot be taken out of protection as long as it is in use, and because of the activism and the neo-fascist gatherings, it was considered in use. So that was one of the issues. So obviously I'm arguing here that this is a decision that is very much a contextualization that no one talked about because people thought it was just a given. So could the public make the decision that the monument should not be cared for anymore? Could we let go of care as part of a reconsideration of such monuments? Just after the winning design was announced, the city made another decision, actually the preservation office again. It made the decision that the monument needed to be cleaned before the tilting could take place, and the reason was not just the graffiti, but a particular part, a particular paint that had been used, which they claimed was corrosive. So another contextualization took place right after the tilting was announced. And just so you know what will be done, they will remove the statue from the base, clean it, and then put it back on the base. So because the city was under pressure for a couple of years while the, sorry, that was wrong. While the competition was announced and going on, they actually did another temporary recontextualization, which was done by two artists, Six and Petrich, who did a research project and realized that in Vienna you have many more dedications to Karl Lueger, and they did outlines of these dedications, which is bridges, churches, busts, and so on and so forth, and dragged them and put them into the square as those kind of pretty ugly building mats. So in the heated situation of Vienna, that project was mostly hated. It was hated by the removalists because they claimed it was a duplication or multiplication of the Lueger myth, something I don't agree with. I think that's simplistic because the point was that it was, yes, an ugly multiplication because the point was this was a bigger problem that the audience or the public had to deal with. It was also disliked by people who wanted to talk about the monument as a sign or an educational project that needed to stay in public space because it complicated the matter, right? So the idea of not focusing on that project but to broaden the discussion somehow didn't flow in that heated climate. So I only have a very limited time, and to get the discussion going, I just show you two and a half projects that were part of the competition but did not win. So Clegg and Goodman wanted to stage a permanent confrontation. They wanted to leave the monument but put up another monument for Bertha Pappenheim, who should be prominent really as a very interesting and important journalist, political journalist around 1900, is more famous though as being the person Anna O in Freud's writing. So I mean, this is another thing we can discuss, maybe the kind of counter monument that is being put in space. I'm not usually a fan of this because it just replicates the form of the traditional monument that I think really needs to be dismantled rather than duplicated. So here we have a problem of duplication, I think. But Anna Jarmoleva, who is representing Austria at the biennial at the moment, proposed something different. She proposed to just replicate the base, which is pretty substantial, and to work with the light. So take the light away from the Lueger monument and focus the light on the empty base, like that which we cannot remove is kind of removed in the counter-proposal. And then this was a proposal that was discussed quite a bit by Yael Batana, who is right now also at the biennial in the German pavilion. And she suggested a project that she called the Lueger Trial. And she worked with images from the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem, where, you know, many of us, depending on age, I think we know like the image of Eichmann being behind like a glass cube for the trial. So I think this proposal was both complicated because the connection isn't quite clear, even though she wanted to have like a panel and a photo of the Eichmann trial to make sure everyone understood what the relationship was. But it also, to my mind, somehow looks like the glass many cities use during the winter time to actually protect the monument. So there's, again, a problem, I think, with the form which dedicates care rather than a trial, right? So those are some of the proposals that went up. And I would have a lot, but I think really what I want to talk about is in such context of recontextualizations, I really want to make sure that we talk about the decisions that are made by administrators and the city. In Vienna, we have the city, and we also have the first district, we have the preservation office, and all these kind of decisions that were sneaked into the project, like the cleaning, that should be much more prominent in the discussion. Thank you.
I now invite all the panelists from the first session to take a seat here on the stage. And I would like to be connected with Lewis as well. Just this. Okay. So I will begin with a round of questions, beginning with Lewis. So you said that you were able to involve the artists, but not at the very first stage of the urban planning, but early enough to be able to kind of rethink of the project. So my question is, how were you able to involve the artists in time to change the project, and also which is the real agency artists have in this kind of very complex plans?
Yes, thank you. So the second question is much easier to answer. I think artists have very little agency. Everything depends on having a patron. I mean, the decision maker. In this instance, it's a local government is also the developer. So they are in charge of. They create the team that does the planning and that implements it. And so, for anything significant to happen, the leader of the local government has to want it to happen. It's not nothing will happen without political decision making. Of course, this is a situation we're well aware of, and so myself and the other and the creative Folkestone authority, we do as much lobbying as we can, and we get as close to the decision makers as we can in order to try to influence their thinking. But in the end, of course, it's a political decision, and that political decision is normally taken by a politician in order to further their own interests, rather than in the cause for the sake of art or for the sake of the future residents of a new town. So my involvement came through Creative Folkestone, and Creative Folkestone has been appointed as what they call the creative partner to the development, which cynically one could say is a part of the marketing for the future town. They need to market this town to people who are going to come and buy the houses, and the unique selling point, as I tried to suggest earlier, is that they want to attract people who are interested in the environment, the green surroundings, the countryside, and they want to attract people who are what we call creatives. I mean, this is because the connection to London is very good, so it's possible for people to live in Otterpoo Park and work in London because it's just a quick train ride away. So, but why not? It's great.
Yeah, but isn't there, and it's also a question for Mechtild, Isn't there a risk of investing the artist of some responsibilities, somewhat, of delegating, especially when it comes with controversial projects like, the recontextualization of a monument, but also, with projects of developing new areas? Isn't it somewhat a form of giving to the artist a responsibility and kind of art washing the operation?
If I may go on, I think art is only as good as the patron in a way. I mean, we are so fixed on the artist still. Artists, particularly in public, artists who work in public space, are dealing with, well, we've been talking about it. It's a very complex situation. There are many factors, and so the artist has to put themselves at the service of the larger context. And as I say, I think we only get wonderful architecture if we have wonderful people commissioning architects. Unfortunately, we have too many terrible buildings, and we also have a lot of public art that is not so wonderful.
Yeah.
And this is because it's not just the artists. Artists make it. It's the dialogue between the artist and the patron. However you constitute that patron, it can be the public or the politician or the developer or whatever. But it's the dialogue between the artist and the power or the money that makes the good art. It isn't just the artist, and we can't ask the artist to take responsibility.
So in my context, I think it's a bit different because a lot of the questions are political questions, and the politicians are very eager to get rid of the responsibility, right? They say, hey, let's recontextualize, right? And find some artists. So while I think that art can do a lot, there is a problem with commissioning artists who recontextualize. There's a lot of art that does that, through its own drive. So yes, it is certainly an issue, and I think political decisions need to be made on a political level, but art can contribute to a certain extent. But it should not be the responsibility of the artist to be the historian, the politician, and the peacemaker.
Thank you. Elisabeth, I would love to hear you as well on this, thinking, getting back to the fact that you talked about new democracies. So how do you believe is the role of the artist, the agency of the artist?
Yeah, I think I absolutely agree with what Louis said in terms of, interesting how you phrased it, Louis. The artist is only as good as the commissioner or as the patron, but that dialogue between the artist and the commissioner, responding to the context, or also, as you said, Louis, being at the service of the context. It has to be inevitably a conversation, a compromise, a dialogic relationship with context.
This makes me think about when years ago we did the project for Museo del Novecento with Italo Rota, the architect who just passed away. And of course, when it comes to big projects, big architectural projects, there's always, a dialogue and sometimes a controversial relationship with the institution. And I remember him talking about an adult relationship with institutions. This word adult, I still have it, in my mind, because of course, there's a level of commitment and responsibility that should be shared. And this gets me to talk about censorship, Oscar. So the panel that Vula talked about, mentioned about this morning, the one she organized with Austin when they were still working in Sweden, and the panel in which I was involved, there was an artist, Carolina Falkholt, who was censored, a muralist, for painting a vagina. So you talked to us about this quite visionary, I have to say, project of public art in military facilities, which also I would love to hear more in terms of when was it began and who was, who had this great idea. But the point is, when it comes to changing or censoring some artworks, what is the policy which takes place? What are the rules in Sweden?
Well, I would say it's no clear rules. I mean, in principle, because this public art agency, which is started out in the late 1930s, and they had the policy was that they would, like with the backing of a state cultural policy, commission new works for governmental agencies all over the country, as well as having this collection and just placing works. So in principle, it's no difference between commissioning a work for the military institution or for any other government agency. Of course, in practice, it tends to be, I've looked at the prisons as well, and of course there's different kind of regulations coming from these government agencies, and they are of course kind of arbitrary. I mean, it's not based on any real principle from their part, but for example, there's no nudity in prisons, no vaginas. Can be vaginas in police stations, but not in prisons. So I think it's very much on this level. And actually, I think I just went to this very interesting, I think, exhibition that was organized by the Public Art Agency, which featured works that government agencies have sent back in recent decades. So things they didn't want anymore in their facilities. And of course, it's like a lot of washing out of anything sexual, anything political. So this kind of going on, like this kind of, I don't know, like insta-migration, how do you call it? It's ever becoming more clean, neutral, these government agencies. We used to be, I think, more open for diversity and not always for the better, I would say. There's some problematic works as well, but...
And Fang-Tze, ASEAN is a project of the end of the 70s, and it looks to me that it was quite an innovative project, because I also understood that the artists were like mingling and working together to produce some sculpture. Of course, like the outcome is now very much historical. It's sculptures, right? Just sculptures. So do you think the scope of the initiative is still being complied by these sculptures? And if not, what would it be an updated version of a project like this? Up to you.
So I think in a sense for the ASEAN Sculptural Garden initiative have to be put into the context of a series of cultural events initiated by ASEAN COSI, which is the culture and information. And it was actually very industrial driven, which you have very strong focusing on media arts, media, information exchange, but also film precisely. There was a lot of effort put into it. In terms of visual art, ASEAN Sculpture Garden was the very first one, commissioned artists to produce work with a discursive component, which is a symposium, before the opening of the Sculpture Garden. So following that, interesting enough, based on the archival research, which is quite unfortunate, the Sculpture Garden is currently kind of tucked away and be forgotten. If you go to Singapore, you ask people where is ASEAN Sculpture Garden, they probably have no idea where it is. But it kind of tucked away in this massive urban garden park situation called Fort Canning Park, which is also a colonial site. But the ongoing issue with this kind of symposium component is, in fact, to utilize this symposium to garner enough media attention, which in the 80s is newspaper. So based on my archival research, it's just consecutively every day they have something about this particular park, talk about the artists, where they come from, but not much about what exactly is the information of the art. So I think interesting enough because the change hands. So the ASEAN cultural information committee is no longer function as what it is. It's purely an association to get information. However, there's a new foundation kind of producing work, which the last video I showed at the end of the presentation is one of its results, a contemporary revisiting, but also open space to have a response to the various sculpture garden around the region. So you do have artists with a more critical thoughts to understand the issues of the origination of the land, which of course in Southeast Asia, there's still a lot of indigenous practices. But the other interesting note also should mention is the foundation is financially independent, not belong to the ASEAN countries, but the funding is now coming from Korea. So you have another complexity comes in, thinking about the international relationship in commission, new project to have critical response to the past. But what does that mean when the funding and the support is coming from East Asian country, which have, of course, a very strong rooting for popular culture, media consumption in the Southeast Asian country. So I think there's certain complexity here that will be a different paper to talk about this topic. Yeah.
Thank you. And then my last question to any of you who wants to answer it. Public art heritage, especially in the urban space, might be considered as an open-air museum. But there's no such thing as ICOM. A couple of years ago, Marilyn was invited. We made an ICOM panel online. It was COVID period 3 years ago, to promote the idea of funding a committee for public art. So why do you believe there are, or if there are, any shared policies on an international level? Go, Elisabeth.
I can start with a response.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it goes back to the complexity of the fields that we all inhabit. I mean, within our project, we talk about the expanded field of public art, which is a very generous sort of definition. It's like the intersection of contemporary art and culture, social practice, and public context. So there's quite a lot in there to grapple with. And I think I also mentioned some of that during my presentation. So I guess there's a complexity there. You know, while it's quite a generous field in terms of openness and expansiveness, it's quite hard to define. There's so many different agendas at stake, which is what we were talking about earlier. And I think what you were hinting at also with that question around the agency of the artists. So who is the work for is a question that should lead really a creation of those policies that you mentioned. I mean, there are organizations that operate in this field that are developing research, and you know, Up Projects has been leading constellations, which I also mentioned earlier. And within that, we've been opening up the conversation, not just to artist curators, but also to commissioners, to kind of like address some of the challenges within the power dynamics between the artists, the creatives, and the commissioners, and local authorities, and the regen sector. So kind of like bringing, not just in a way preaching to the converted, to those who are already on board with some of the ideas that we feel are important to take forward in public art, but also bringing in people who are in decision-making positions, in powerful positions, such as the politician, you know, mentioned earlier. So with constellations, we advance the research, but we're not thinking of, we're not defining policies as such. Although policies is definitely one of the angles that we are addressing with the program in 2024-2025. So how do we align our concerns or our themes with existing policies, not only in the contemporary art and culture sector, but also at governmental level? So that alignment would help us make long-term
Thank you. Yeah.
So I think I want to question the concept of a museum a little bit. I don't think public art is a museum. A museum, whatever you think of it, is an educational environment, and public space should be much more than that. And I think this is also why it's very hard to come up with rules that are, you know, considered an expanded museum, because it's very much about representation, social representation, various histories. Public space is heterogeneous, is not accessible to all, even though we think that public art is not always public. That's actually something Lucy Lippert asked in the 1970s. When is public art public? Not always, as it turns out. So I think it's very complicated, and the environment is so I think, I'm sure regulations would be interesting to discuss, but maybe not as an outdoor museum.
Yeah, yeah. I hear you, but museums too are very complicated.
Oh, totally. I know, this is why I was like, okay,
are not always
I'm not going to talk about I know,
You know.
totally.
I would ask Lewis. I mean, he is chairman for the Institute for Public Art, so, and it's a global network. So I wonder whether did you ever talk about like shared policies at an international level?
I think the main thing which we founded the Institute for Public Art mainly in order to share information, because information travels so badly about public art. And this is, in some ways, this is a good thing. It's a reflection of the fact that public art, the best public art, is very often site-specific and context-specific, and is deeply embedded in the culture, in a local culture. And that's something to be celebrated. But at the same time, because every local culture is unique, the information about that local culture doesn't travel because the market can find no way to make money out of it, and it's only the market that drives information. And so this is what we have found in the more than 10 years now of our researches, is that we keep discovering completely new things we knew nothing about, because there has been no financial incentive for anyone to talk to anyone else about it. So it's a wonderful field. But having been a museum director, I also want to go back to the museum question, and the two basic functions of the museum are to interpret and to educate, obviously, but also to preserve material culture. I mean, and when the museum wants to move outside the museum, that becomes a problem, because so in my view, the function of the museum as educator and interpreter can move outside the museum walls very easily, but the function of preservation and conservation, which is also intrinsic to museums, conservation of material culture, is all at sea once it moves outside the museum walls, because the world moves on all the time. And this is why it's important to have museums to stop the deterioration of material culture. But of course, outside the museum walls, outside the collection, everything changes all the time, and our museums are already struggling to find the resources everywhere to continue doing what they do. And I think it's unless there is a real change of policy at a high level. I'm speaking also as a former citizen of Liverpool, where the World Heritage Site has been withdrawn. The title of World Heritage Site was awarded to Liverpool some years ago, and now has been withdrawn. because it was impossible to reconcile the aims of the World Heritage Site with the aims of the local economy. And in the end, you know, the economy matters. You know, the citizens of Amsterdam, the citizens of Venice don't much care for the tourism that is overwhelming their cities because they're heritage sites. So there are big problems if when museums want to take over these functions outside the museum walls. I'm not saying it isn't a courageous and wonderful thing to try to do, but it's problematic.
Yeah, no, I hear you, and there will be a lot of things to discuss about. Also, you know, considering that this is a so-called ethnographic museums, and we are really rethinking about our relationship towards the collections, you know, including the idea of restitutions and maybe the idea of letting go some of the artworks or objects. But I want to open this discussion to the public too, so if there's any question, you are welcome to ask. Raise your hand in case. And while we wait for someone to make a question, I want to ask also Oscar and Fang-Tze if they want to relate with what we have told so far.
About the cultural heritage. Well, it's you're speaking from the perspective of the Sweden or Nordic countries, a similar mode. Of course, we have to be aware of the regional or national legislations, which are often quite specific. And I'm not perhaps the best person to speak about it. It's publications in English as well. But the Public Art Agency has tried to award this government art the status of cultural heritage, because it's quite interesting. If like in the 80s, one of the arguments for placing this huge amount of works within these agencies, which were state spaces, was that it would be easier to conserve them than in the open. So, but what they didn't really calculate was that in the 90s we would see this huge privatization of public or state agencies and public property, which means that the works that these permanent works, they are called in Swedish, they are building attached, which means legally that they are attached to the building. So when the building is sold, it goes over to the next, to the ones. So it becomes actually this huge privatization of public art within these buildings, and then which makes it, of course, very much the agency loses control, but it's still, of course, like this ownership rights of the artworks. But you know, these private enterprises are not caring so much for these kind of works. So there's been this discussion and a lot of work from the Public Art Agency to raise it to the status of cultural heritage, to strengthen.
This is another big issue. I mean, the privatization of public artworks.
Yeah.
Fang-Tze?
Just a very quick response in terms of thinking about both terms, museum and public art. In the context of Southeast Asia, I think it's very crucial to, I mean, at least for our Singapore Art Museum, we're fairly aware the kind of importance and responsibility to decolonize this particular notion. Thinking about museum in a sense, in the context we still have museum holds objects, however, it's a continuation of colonial legacies. So what does that mean to have a museological intervention into that particular conversation? On the other hand, thinking about public art, the most well-known statue is Sir Stamford Rafford, still sit in front of the ASEAN, the Asian Civilization Museum at the center of the city. So what does that mean to encounter those kind of colonial legacies every day? So why exactly to bring that conversation in the context of Singapore and other rest of Southeast Asian countries? Another thing also I need to mention is the permanency, thinking about collection. As I mentioned, the difficulty in Singapore to maintain the care a public sculpture have to do with weather, extreme heat and extreme humidity. So part of the recent initiative by our museum, Singapore Art Museum, is this particular idea of this particular project called the Everyday Museum. It's a 2-year-round cycle. If you're interested, you can just the everydaymuseum.sg. It's a 2-year-round cycle. We in fact commission artists to produce every 2 years. We change the work of art along the railway corridor, which is a kind of a green park connecting from south to the north. Used to be Malaysian railway. So what happened is every 2 years we have new commission. Some of the work we let outside to naturally deteriorate it. But apart from that, I think one of the most huge we treat this as the notion of constituent museum as well, in a sense to constantly monthly activating programs around the project. So instead of have physical museums, have physical work of art, the constant activation, constant negotiation, constant gathering around the commission is another approach we have. So in a sense, for the concern, we do have a very strong care. It's not so much the permanency, it's the notion of keeping activation around the project.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So I'll end this panel. We can have like 9 minutes of break, and then I'll hand it over to Romy Crawford for the second session on monumentality. Thank you.
Should start? Okay, great. Okay, I'm going to get started while you are getting seated. Again, I'm Romy Crawford, and we were off to a great start this morning with, of course, the topic of policies and soft power. And we're going to move to the topic and thematic of anti-monumentality. Something I think about a lot, given my research on the Wall of Respect, a 1967 mural that was both an anti-monumental public artwork and also has so much commemoration in it as well. So with that, we're going to start with our first presenter for the anti-monumentality panel, and that's Janelle Austin. Janelle is Executive Director and Community Member of the George Floyd Global Memorial. Janelle is also the creator of the Racial Agency Initiative, a racial justice leadership coaching company. She is also the lead caretaker of the George Floyd Global Memorial. Let's welcome Janelle Austin.
Good morning. So they put me as a protester right after government. I just want to first begin just by offering greetings. Thank you to the Getty and MUDEC for everything and putting things together for the staff. Thank you to my community in George Floyd Square. I also want to acknowledge that the land on which we protest is Dakota and Ojibwe stolen lands. And then finally, I want to acknowledge that my mother is here, Reverend Dr. Judy Austin. And since Sunday is Mother's Day, I score major points against my 6 siblings. So on May 25th, 2020, George Floyd was lynched by the Minneapolis Police Department. In response to this atrocity, people protested all over the world with art at the heart of the protest. The 2020 uprising was a mixture of creative expressions of pain and hope. People marched in streets carrying protest signs that many created in a moment of urgency with recycled goods and black markers. People painted murals of remembrance on storefronts, boarded up with plywood or walls and billboards ripe for a new piece of graffiti art. They screen printed digital designs of the protests on t-shirts as it was happening. They destroyed historical monuments that stood as symbols of oppression to marginalized people groups. Many of these monuments were contested for decades, but the 2020 uprising amplified the courage of masses of people to declare that they had enough. The 2020 uprising is not, however, a mere story of destruction, ashes, and pain. It is also a story of creating a new imagination for pleasure, possibility, and preservation. These ideas of pain and hope were most present at the epicenter of the public lynching of George Floyd in the intersection of East 38th Street and Chicago Avenue South in Minneapolis, Minnesota, now known as George Floyd Square. I, along with many of my neighbors, joined the movement by sustaining a memorial that upheld the memory of Black death through state-sanctioned violence and the evidence of anti-Blackness. In this short paper, I will use George Floyd Square as a case study to engage ethical questions surrounding the memorialization of Black people killed by state-sanctioned violence in the United States through public protest art. And just so you know, I define protest as disrupting business as usual to signal that there is something wrong that needs to be made right. So at the center of the intersection where Mr. Floyd took his last breath, Indigenous women cleansed the space with incense and prayer. Subsequently, the people deemed it a sacred space and began to organically build and care for a memorial that grew to the size of 4 square blocks. Thousands of people added their personal voices of protest to the memorial daily, uplifting hundreds of names of lynched victims in addition to George Floyd's name. Neighbors called each contribution a memorial offering. These offerings ranged from protest signs, teddy bears, flowers, and balloons to painted rocks, crosses, mini Buddhas, crystals, photographs, drawings, and notes. Large sculptures shaped in the image of Black Power fists were installed. Billboards of protest art were raised in solidarity. Large murals and art installations, of which 2 span the width of a city block, were installed. Hundreds of names of Black victims of state-sanctioned violence were lifted up through protest art as the intersection became a canvas for public grief and protest. Stolen lives written on the canvas of stolen Indigenous Dakota land, we acknowledge that egregious historical narrative too. Preservation as protest is our motto, and it is guided by 2 principles. 1, everything is somebody's offering, therefore nothing is thrown away. And 2, the people are more sacred than the memorial itself. We are people over property all day, every day. We have to be. Racism at its core requires that we misremember and disremember story, culture, and heritage in order to control the narrative and historical records. After all, if people cannot remember, over time, whatever should be remembered will cease to exist, including people. I found myself asking the question, what is a monument? Engaging my preservation intern, Redemption Peters DeRose, to help me research and consulting the Black Art Conservators Group, I walked with this question, what is a monument? To summarize my conclusion, a monument is a structure, big or small, erected to remember a person or moment that is significant to a group of people still living to tell the story. The most common form of monuments are in the form of graveyard headstones, and the most expensive and remembered monuments are often erected by governments. And unlike many great works of art like The Last Supper by Leonardo da Vinci, which I have reserved my ticket to visit, they're not designed to remember the artist. They are designed to remember the moment. Monuments are storytellers that outlive us. With the help of the living, they contain and transfer memory to each generation. Naturally, my next question is George Floyd Square a monument, or does it reject the idea of monuments? We are 4 years into building an organic memorial that is created and kept by the people as a living memorial. On Saturday, hours before I hopped on my flight to Italy, I was with about 50 of my neighbors and some visitors tending to George Floyd Square and refreshing the memorials after winter takes its toll. We are actively both creating and preserving memory in a place we hope will exist for generations to come. But because this is an active protest, we are constantly under the political threat of erasure and the commandeering of our collective narrative. Many people want a monument, but our tools are temporary, and the government, which is holding many of the tools that could make this permanent, is also the entity that brought us this moment in the first place, that is, the lynching of Black bodies. Fundamentally, we cannot use colonized tools and methods to build a decolonized memory. The quest for understanding the desecration of old monuments and the building of new monuments is locked up in financial and institutional establishments built by colonizing political systems of oppression. We who were protesting in George Floyd Square, or who are protesting in George Floyd Square, quickly realized that money is how that narrative would and could be controlled. While others were swiftly accepting millions of dollars of funding, as they should have, we could not. We had to first figure out what it means to build a community that is free as people over property. And this collective posture was shaped by the question, what does justice look like? Simultaneously, there have been cries from other community members for the government to make this place a historical national monument and/or a museum. So, to demonstrate due diligence for our neighbors, we did a little research and learned that in the United States, in order for a location to be deemed as historical, it had to have existed for at least 50 years. But the argument could also be made that nothing like it will exist in the next 50 years. While we were off strategizing, an artist who is a protester fabricated historical site signs that looked like official government signs. Well, this begs another question. Why do the people, Black and non-Black, who are in a fight for Black liberation from state-sanctioned violence have a desire for the existing government to recognize what the people created as a national monument? Organically, we have erected ephemeral objects, large and small, whose artists naturally shy away from recognition to not detract from the protest. We have people designated to care for the memory to ensure that the people get to tell their own stories. Independent and mainstream journalists have documented that the 2020 uprising was unprecedented. We rejected government funding to sustain the authenticity of the protests, and we have been rejected from funds because of who we were and are. 4 years later, people still visit our intersection of protests from all over the world to bear witness to not only our protests, but to theirs that took place thousands of miles away. People come to pay respects to the lives that were forced to become ancestors prematurely. If we have all the ingredients to be an organic monument, why do some still seek government recognition from the entity that continues to take Black life and force our hands to add names to this memorial? The only answer I have concluded is that our minds and expectations are conditioned to desire colonized structures because forms of colonization is all we have ever known. For any of us to take the leap to a new imagination of a decolonized life, it will require a childlike imagination of what life could look like on the other side of justice. In some ways, I believe this is why the film Black Panther has such a profound cultural effect. The creative minds who poured their imaginations into the script and set design strive to create an uncolonized place for Black people. They had to create a parallel modern experience that no one living has personally known. George Floyd Square is pushing toward that imagination, starting with the outpouring of love for Black life and grief of Black death through art as protest. The essence of this memorial and protest is building a new imagination of what it means to practice community. We have a chant that we continue to raise to remind ourselves who we are. As in Black traditions, it is call and response. The self-appointed leader cries out, "Show me what community looks like." And all in earshot respond, "This is what community looks like." We usually invoke this chant when we are loving each other and actively caring for our collective well-being together. In every way, the memorial as an object, place, and symbol is a monument of love. A system of government cannot love people. People can love people. George Floyd Square is a kind of people's monument, whether or not the government succeeds in making it a government monument, and they are trying. Simultaneously, this organic memorial that is preserved by the people is anti-monument. It is not one thing that is designed to last forever. It is many things participating in a life cycle that is designed to keep the people remembering. Some of the objects can last forever. Others can only hold on for a moment. But together, they hold the memory of protests that we keep. Through memorial preservation, we uphold the people's question, what does justice look like? And we uphold the human question, why are Black people still dying by the hands of state-sanctioned violence? And until these questions are answered through the erasure of the need for the questions themselves, and not the stories of what happened, our collective work to preserve this memorial still stands. Thank you. No justice, no streets.
Thank you, Janelle Austin. And we're going to move to Magda Rossi's presentation. Magda Rossi from the Colectivo Persueltos specializes in international cooperation and socio-cultural management. She worked as the coordinator of the visual arts area of the Proyecto Martedero in Bolivia and collaborates with Fundación Terrazulugo. Let's welcome Magda Rossi.
Thank you very much for the invitation. A very big hug to my colleagues and brother who couldn't come. So I'd like to take you on a brief journey to La Paz, Bolivia, with this presentation. So Ñatinta is a festival, is a mural painting festival. Sorry. Okay. In the cemetery of La Paz. The idea was requalify, embellish the spaces of the cemetery, starting from the typical philosophy of Andean culture that see the death as a complement of life. And in particular, we inspired to the ñatitas, that are skulls, celebrating by the people of La Paz. They are like protector, and in the month of November, 8th of November, there is a party very, very important for these skulls. And all the month of November and October is very important for the people of La Paz by Aymara tradition, because there is like a party with the people who they lost and loved, and that they are in the cemetery. So they go to the cemetery with the musician, with food, with a lot of friends, and celebrating the memory of their loved ones. So I want to show you some videos to understand the atmosphere. Okay. Okay.
El espíritu está en el cielo, te ve, dice, está junto contigo. El cuerpo nomás está enterrado.
Yo creo que en nuestra sociedad, en la mía, la muerte es un tabú y creo que acá se vive muy diferente.
Nalagana ukisa, wakatan tau futimasti ampatar, apakan kanya menimasti lortapon, kami setiap menegak menak kucasir pampacap. Kam hanirak wachikat impunya yang kanakat kispia preta paz de Cristo que Ave María Purísima sin pecado concebir, tú te vas a confidir. Yo quise mal, hay ratos también todo mal, este es por acero, hay ratos todo quiere así ayuda, alma bendita, milagroso, alma lo que tiene más poder.
Nuestra vida se inició en este suelo. Sobre nosotros viven nuestros ancestros. Hombres, animales, tigres, pájaros. Este territorio es nuestro hogar. Debemos protegerlo. Los blancos decían que éramos salvajes. No entendían nuestras oraciones. Cuando danzamos al sol, a la luna o al viento, sin comprender, nos condenaban como almas perdidas.
So as you can see, it's very different. So it's very different from the European ones, European symmetry. So for us it was very important the feedback of the person to move forward, no? And in that symmetry, it's possible to do that because of the context, because of the philosophy of the context, and. For the artist, it's a unique experience, obviously, because it's a very strange way to live the death and the art and reflect about that and art and memory. And there are some reflections that I think we can speak after in the table. But it's important to understand how we can protect this heritage and not block the production, I think. And I think it's very important to try to understand how we can give sustainability to this kind of event in this public space. So it's like two reflection for after, I think. And thank you very much. If you want to take a look, in our website, there we are a lot of video and photo and stories, so you can follow us.
Thank you, Magda. And now we'll move to Dr. David Todd Lawrence, who is Associate Professor at the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, Minnesota, where he teaches African American literature and culture, folklore studies, and cultural studies. So we welcome Dr. Todd Lawrence. And also Heather Shirley is with us. And Heather, are you going to actually present as well? Okay, all right. So Heather Shirley is also here, who's a professor of art history at the University of St. Thomas. Her teaching and research focuses on race and identity, migrations and diasporas, and street art and its communities. And so together with geographer Dr. Paul Lorak, Dr. Shirley, and Dr. Lawrence, they co-direct the Urban Art Mapping Research Team. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We're a research team, and we have the honor of working together and learning together. And so it's really meaningful to get to present together, even though it's a little bit unusual. So thank you for listening to us and for having us here. On June 5th, 2020, amid nationwide uprisings demanding justice and police accountability for the killing of George Floyd, artists and volunteers in Washington, D.C. painted a monumental Black Lives Matter mural directly on the paved surface of 16th Street, the main artery leading to the White House. This collectively produced street mural was initiated by DC's Mayor, Muriel Bowser, who also participated in its creation, and it was led by artist Keona Jones, who's on the far left in this photograph, along with many other artists and volunteers. The DC mural was part of a conversation that played out through a large number of murals painted directly on the pavement. In the weeks and months that followed its creation, hundreds of similar murals were painted on the surface of public cities around the world. These murals created a purposeful and necessary disruption in the streets from small towns to the nation's largest metropolitan areas. Most of them read Black Lives Matter, but there were other variations such as Black Trans Lives Matter, Power to the People, and End Racism Now. Street murals were painted in cities across the political spectrum. Many were created in locations where protests were sustained over weeks or months, but they were also painted in cities where protests were very limited. Project leadership took many forms, with various murals being led by Black artists, white artists, multiracial groups, professional artists, volunteers, protesters, and in one case, a high school football team led the project. Some were sanctioned and created with overt support from an active participation of government leaders, as in the case of Washington, D.C., but others were completed in a clandestine manner and in direct violation of orders from local authorities. Focusing on the experiences of artists, organizers, and community members, our research team explores the complex conversations and narratives surrounding the Washington, D.C. Black Lives Matter street mural, as well as other Black Lives Matter murals in streets around the city, in cities around the country and around the world. While the DC mural has been protected and preserved, many other murals have not survived, and many were, in fact, designed to be temporary. Whether permanent or ephemeral, we argue that the murals have a number of features in common, allowing us to think of them as a collective form of protest art and a new approach to monumentalization, or as we might consider it now, anti-monumentalization. They demand recognition by way of their monumental scale and location. They mark Black belongingness in locations that were otherwise exclusionary. They purposefully disrupt space, creating necessary friction for people moving through these spaces. When seen collectively, the street murals create a network that connects cities around the country and around the world through a shared visual form. And rather than reinforcing power, as many traditional monuments do, they are designed to resist power. And finally, and notably for us as scholars of street art, they monumentalize using the visual language of street art, thus harnessing its immediacy, its presumed spontaneity, and its ephemerality, allowing for a form of new monument. While the murals together form a collective monument, our research in individual cities allows us to see the complexity of local dynamics that shape each mural. Widely seen as the first of its kind, the BLM street mural in DC was created in the context of peaceful protests that turned violent due to clashes with the Secret Service, presidential shenanigans, and tensions between the federal and local governments that escalated over several days, culminating in the creation of this mural. The DC mural has taken on the form of a monument in many obvious ways. When necessary roadwork was completed, the city made the decision to preserve the mural, increasing its longevity by repainting it with traffic paint and blocking off part of the street so that it's limited to pedestrian traffic. The new name for the plaza was voted to be permanent by the DC City Council in October 2020. But it's, in fact, quite a complex story, more complex than it may appear.
During our field work in DC, folks we interviewed, artists who worked on the murals, activists who spent weeks and months protesting at that site, and representatives of Mayor Bowser's office all talked about things such as the historical and ongoing tensions between Washington, D.C. as a Black-led federal district and the federal government, which determines its laws and finances, as well as the influence of go-go music and other cultural elements of DC's historic Black community. All of this is to say that each BLM street mural has its own local significances as they are inspired by local, social, cultural, and political factors. Additionally, because of their scale, BLM street murals are collective community endeavors. Often initiated or led by an individual or small group, they require a much larger group of people, artists, volunteers, and sometimes public works employees to pull off. This is important because so many BLM street murals are vandalized, are removed, or fade away with time. If, as we argue, the over 250 BLM street murals constitutes a marking of a collective moment of political resistance, then it cannot only be the physical murals themselves that create this. It is also the collective experience of creating the murals, the communal act of coming together, the memories that people create in doing so, and the healing and individual and group expression that happens as part of that creation. Where BLM street murals are located is often significant, but that meaning can be complicated and contested. So we're going to show a couple of clips from 2 interviews we conducted in preparation for our trip to document the mural in DC for the first time. The first is from an activist, Kevin Kramer, a longtime activist in DC, and the second is from the lead artist, Kiana Jones. And we'll see if this will play.
I think about that space, and it's not a space that we've reclaimed. We don't go to that space anymore. We haven't been there since 2020, since it became a tourist attraction, since it became a place of profit, a place of putting money over people's lives and experience. It's called Black Lives Matter Plaza. John Lewis, that may have been the last public seating he had in DC being seen, but that does not represent or reflection of Black people. That's not a Black space. If you think about blacks, imagine this, all the schools that are in DC, all the schools, full of Black students, no one's taking their students to go see Black Lives Matter Plaza. That says a lot.
Just think it's more of a statement. Like, it's where he wanted to do his whole Bible shenanigans. It's right at one of like the most historic and expensive hotels. It's right in front of the White House. Like, you go outside and you see it from the gate. So I just think it's a big standpoint. And we've done our own murals in our own communities, but those are places, like you said, that we don't always frequent, or people don't think that we should be, or there's like this air of who you should be if you're in that area. So I think it's just a flat statement that we're here, we're everywhere, and we're not going anywhere. You're just gonna have to figure it out.
Okay, so while at first these 2 statements seem to be contradictory, Kevin and Kiana are actually speaking about the space in ways that we think overlap. It can be both possible that Black Lives Matter Plaza is not and never was a Black space except during the time when activists and protesters occupied it, and that it is now a kind of marker of Black experience and belongingness in a space that continues to be one of white power and commerce. As we have argued, each BLM street mural functions in a unique way determined by its local conditions. Reverend Bauer, another person we interviewed, spoke to this point as well, explaining that the mural now acts as a statement to a specific power base and tells a story about the conflict and violence that took place there, as well as the folks who held that space in protest. Though the space is not currently one that Black folks or activist allies currently consider important, as Kevin argues, it does mark the site of resistance and attest to a continued and undeniable Black presence in DC. It is a form of Black annotation, to borrow from Christina Sharp, marking in public space the reality of Black life, experience, and being. This monumental asterisk on the streets of our nation's capital marks the site of an event of Black ontological significance. Black Lives Matter street murals, like other kinds of vernacular expression, become more impactful together than they are individually. It is one thing to witness the now curated and protected monument in DC, existing in a city of traditional monuments, challenging their function and form, but to know that there are more than 250 others that artists, activists, and community members created to answer, as a way to answer the question that we hear so often when we're interviewing folks, that they say, what could we do? That was the question they were asking. We saw the monument in DC, what could we do? Is an even more impressive realization. The shared visual elements that connect them and the unique local features that distinguish them provide for a significant specialized cultural performance of monumentalization that could persist as long as the memory of their creation is passed down from generation to generation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Heather, and also David. We are going to move to a presentation by Johnny Monis, Jack Monis, and Jill Monis is looming. I'm not sure if they're going to be here on the stage, but they're with us. So Johnny Monis, whose scholarship is shaped by and builds from Black feminist scholarship on a wide range of topics, particularly their theoretical foundations and the praxis of engagement. By refusing disciplinary confines, they link climate change, Black studies, and international law in order to study the effects of sustainabilities on communities of color. Then Jack Monis is the director of Evora Nord and is part of the transformative arts family, managing all aspects of the initiative, including the active connection with the City Council of Evora, the Eugenio de Almeida Foundation, and the University of Evora. And then I'm going to mention Jill Monis, who organizes ideas and exhibitions for transformative arts and in spaces worldwide. She works with artists and communities to reclaim the commons as a space of diasporic imaginings. She holds a doctorate in anthropology, but her craft was learned from her mother and other radical Black women. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you for that warm introduction. I'd like to take a moment just to thank everybody for making this event possible, for the invitation, and then also to recognize the space that we are present in today, a curated space with selective or permitted accessibility. With that in mind, then, I continue. So the apparatus or dominant construction of space in our everyday lives is narrated and constituted from a singular ethno-class perspective, framed as a macro origin story from the human, for the human. This is by Sylvia Winters and Catherine McKittrick. So with this in mind, spatial and temporal norms are locked into theorizations and entrapments from what they define as man. Going from there, I draw your attention to the screen here. So what may be evident to some and not so evident to others is a slave auction block. This, according to man, is rendered as transparent, something that is equated with the land, something that is not seen and is not recognized. And so what I draw your attention to with this visual is not to play on the scenes of subjugation linking to Saadia Hartman, but is instead the notion of Black geographies as uncovering and disrupting the naturalness of space, and instead asserting that the racialized and sexualized and gendered manner of space is created in dominant spaces. And then from that point forward, I link to Sylvia Winters' notion of the plot, a site of resistance and fugitive practices embedded in culturally defiant, secretive forms of art such as ceremonies, performances, and masks. And it's important to note here that by art, we refer to the labor of our art in the commons, political art and street art, making visible and legible part of the world that speaks back against the confinement and the reduction through the endless messaging of where we are. The where we are ruptures the realm of known possibilities, creating work that speaks recursively across temporalities, disrupting the mastered conceptions of time and place by channeling the multiscalar nature of opaque being. Once more, linking to the scholarship of J.T. Rowan, a prominent Black geographer, he notes, building on Sylvia Wynter, the plot and the plotting named the various iterations of cosmological, geographic, and social outlooks with material and political manifestations, whereby captive Black communities renegotiate the terrain of radical exploitation and the totalitizing social contract envisioned by slave masters and, at the later turn of the century, urban developers and boosters. So linking back to the screen here, these images both rechart alternative forms of spatial relationships, one in community form and one against LACMA. So by linking these alternative and plural identities, cultural practices, cosmological origins, what we intend to draw your attention to here is the fact that these pieces are significant as they open our awareness to the multiple possibilities of worlding that are present in our everyday lives that don't necessarily require a new imaginative principle, but instead a linking to the erased histories that undergird the very foundations of our society. So our slides are slightly different, but so what I'm going to then pass off to my brother here is the notion of what Evora Now, transformative arts, and abolition now attend to. And these are examples of the counter-archives. By rehistoricizing the dimensions of the past, erased by the apparatus of modernity, as we reckon with the role of archives in erasure, they cultivate modes and praxis of survival in the inhospitable state sites through artwork that builds on the sociogenetic principles of community. So I pass this off to you to,
thank you. Clicker. Okay, hello everyone. Thank you, Johnny. With the plot laid out by Johnny, let me give you some context about Évora now and the city of Évora. So the city of Évora was originally a Moorish city, that is until the Romans came and pushed them out up into Spain. Évora was used as the head office of the Spanish Inquisition that orchestrated the death and displacement of countless communities, but mainly those that are brown and black. The attempted erasure of the history is evident by the often overt choices to emphasize the white Christian imagery, especially in the church in Évora, over the diverse communities that inhabited these spaces currently and previously. The work that we do in Évora, as you guys can see up here on the slides, is about more than just connecting past and present to give representation back to these communities, but to emphasize the tools, language, and sensibilities that they have created in the act of freedom making in these hostile environments that they inhabit. So a few examples of the programs that we run at Évora now would be, if you direct your attention to the Polaroids, this is called the Faces of Évora project. So what we wanted to do was not archive the people that come and exist in these spaces that are actively against them, but to show that Évora is very much alive and it exists and it grows not just from the past, but to the present, to the future. And within that, we have people who voluntarily came to be photographed in these spaces that exist against them. Another example would be the June Edmonds inspired project that we did with the community members. One neighborhood in Évora was traditionally an African healer's quarter. So back when Portugal had slave colonies, and they would bring them to the mainland, the quote-unquote freed people would go there to heal those that had been afflicted through labor, through punishment, through humiliation. They had gone there to heal and regain some sense of normalcy. Now, if we go to the next slide. So this slide really describes transformative arts, and I just want to say that these images on Skid Row are collaborative public art events conducted on Skid Row that are in call and response to the histories and conversations with the community. And with that, I'm going to pass the baton back to Johnny here.
Great, thank you. Okay. All right. Sorry. Okay. Yeah, so from Transformative Arts, I now link to the Abolition Now website. And so Abolition Now is a digital collection for the multiple forms of worlding that arise out of revolution, resistance, and building on Sylvia Wynter's principle of the plot. So as you can see on screen, there are images that represent the idea of another world as possible, a commentary on the Minneapolis police, and then the role in which that we will hold each other in the way that the environment is cultivating that kind of relationship. So these pictures engage with the plural cosmological and geographic worldings that critique and de-link from the current reality enunciated from the perspective of man. Commenting on themes such as The Weather by Christina Sharp, Gravity by Tina Campton, Catherine Yusoff, Fire by J.T. Rowan, and The Afterlives of Slavery, which reflexively manifest in our current context. So by studying and reading these images, we can find that there are not only the tools already to free and emancipate ourselves, but the ideas by which new worlds are laden and foundational to our current society, but are erased. And so for the remainder of our presentation, we are going to, this is the Abolition Now site, just as a just to let it be seen. And then for the remainder of our presentation, we will allow this interview to summarize from the Protecting Wealth and Whiteness since 1867.
Okay, so Minneapolis, I mean, that slogan just demanded to be born. So this was created after the police murder of Jamar Clark. Somebody, I haven't been able to track down the photographer, posted a photograph taken at these protests, which were in North Minneapolis, another young man murdered by the police in 2015 or 2016. And that was the photograph of a heavily armed cop on the top of one of their vehicles, right, at this protest, at this peaceful protest. And I found the photograph striking and added the subtext. And this is, I think, really where the deepest meaning is in the subtitle that says Protecting Wealth and Whiteness Since 1867. So again, that's another example of wanting to contribute something to the conversation that isn't there. This poster doesn't say cops bad, people good. This poster says this institution of the police has a particular historical origin, grounding, and purpose. And that's the statement that I felt needed to be made. And interestingly enough, that was on the wall of my shop and sparked a conversation that led to the creation of MPD 150, the local police abolition organization, grassroots organization that created a people's performance review, because it said 1867. This was in 2016. And we looked at that poster and said 2016, 1867 ends in a 7. Dang, next year it's going to be the 150th anniversary of the Minneapolis Police Department. That puts it 2 years after emancipation, a few years after the Dakota Rebellion here in Minnesota. And nobody's ever written a history of the MPD.
Okay. Yes, and this is by artist Ricardo Levins Morales. So thank you very much for your time also.
All right, thank you all so much. I'm going to ask the panelists to come to the stage, and I think we might need an extra chair or two. And I think it's actually appropriate, given what we're going to talk about, that so many of you are working collectively. Heather, if you're able to join as well, and I think both Monises, if you want. We should make that happen, I think. Because it really is indicative, I think, of thinking differently, as many of you mentioned, about the production of this type of work, that many of you are working collectively, and that you're thinking critically about it collectively. So I think that a sign of that is that you've got teams here. And of course, as I mentioned, the case that I know so well, the Wall of Respect, is actually a public artwork that's unnamed, not authored, and that also was made collectively. So I really think that this is absolutely the way these types of projects that emerge out of I don't want to even use the word communities, because I think in some ways this is beyond community, out of vestigial space, vestigial black space, in terms of the way some of you are talking about black geographies and locales, that might be a way for us to think about it. So one of the really urgent questions I think that runs through so many of your posits is has to do with attention, the tension of visibility and invisibility. I think the word that you all mined and that I located over and over again was erasure. You're thinking about erasures, and so, if we're thinking about archives of minoritized people or minoritized forms, which is really for me the index of minoritized people making this work, is that the forms are minoritized. They're small, they're disappearing, they're not locatable, and so the problem then becomes, how do you recognize them in an archive? How do they show up when they don't show up heroically? So I'm wondering if each of you can sort of think about this tension as it plays through your cases and the things you're working on, can think about this tension of visibility and invisibility. And of course it's so rife and hardcore and there within the kind of foundation of black cultural practices, minoritized cultural practices, the tactical strategic bearing of being seen and unseen. So I don't know who wants to start with an address, but
I'll kick off. So I think I want to say, though, that I think erasure and visibility and invisibility are two different things. Because there are, in the memorial at George Floyd Square, there are things that are extremely private that people lay as an extension of their love, their protest, their experience, and it's never intended to be visible. They will wrap it in an envelope, they will tuck it away somewhere behind a rock. Some things they lay with the intent for it to decay and for the intent for it to go away, but it becomes a part of the earth. It becomes a part of the story. While erasure is an intentional act to remove someone else's story, and to not allow their story to be told by them. And so I kind of hold space for invisibility and visibility as people bring their full selves to this protest. But I do not hold space for erasure, because I believe that that is work of colonization to make people who have a voice no longer have a voice.
Thank you.
Yep. So in our project that Heather and I work on, we actually we work on an archive, or we were part of creating an archive where we keep images of all kinds of street art that came up after the murder of George Floyd. And this part of the project with the Black Lives Matter street murals, I think, really has that element of, I really like you distinguishing between like an actual erasure that's an act and the kind of wearing away that we see with Black Lives Matter street murals, because we go to document murals where there is no longer a mural, right? So people painted murals on the streets in these particular places, and they wore away because the paint wasn't permanent. In some cases, that was something that was required of them in order to get a permit from the city or the county or whoever was the dominant political entity. In other cases, that was it just happened that way. It was a sort of happenstance of what was going on that day. But we wanted to think about a way that those moments of community, of coming together, of collective memory, of creating something to mark something, could still be alive even though you can't see them anymore. And so that's why we were thinking about the way that the pieces are connected to each other by the fact that people saw what people were doing in one city and they said, what could we do in our city? And they did something that partially imitates or is connected to what other people did because it echoes some of the same kind of aesthetics of what they were creating, but it's also informed by their own personal, local experience where they are. So even though they might all, a lot of them say Black Lives Matter, some of them say different things, some of them utilize a different sort of lettering structure. There are all kinds of ways in which they're unique for each particular local context. So yeah, we're definitely thinking about that. And I guess in the case of the George Floyd street art database, which is like our first project, and what this sort of fits inside of, that is an attempt to make an intervention to erasure of street art, because street art is something that people see in so many different ways, a lot of times as criminal, right? So we saw the street art that came up in the Twin Cities, which was everywhere, as an expression of people's feelings in that moment, anger, sadness, mourning, etc. But we knew that it was on boards, we knew it was on actual buildings that people own, so it was going to get erased. And so some people actually collected actual boards. We collected the images, because that seemed like a less complicated approach.
Yeah, I think
just hop in. One thing I want to say, just based on the conversation that we're having right now, is it's interesting, I think, to begin at the point of an archive and the role that archives are situated as a baseline for which knowledge and for which engagement can be mediated. And so I think that's why with Abolition Now we're thinking of the notion of an archive as a problematic space, and it's interesting because the role that the archive can take is still unknown in this digital medium. And so the ways in which these pictures and these visuals manifest in this digital medium, we're not necessarily sure like what the outcome of this will be yet. But it is interesting to think that the archive is still the default. And I think that also has to do with the conditioning by which, I think Janelle also made note of this, the conditioning by which the Western society and largely the structures of man still condition and frame our knowing and our knowledge systems. So I think I would like to also make note, just as a partial disagreement, that I think erasure also happens unknowingly as well. It's very laden in the way that we understand Christina Sharp's The Weather, Tina Camp's Gravity, and how these notions of worlding and the way that the world is structured based on a very specific vernacular and point of enunciation labels and creates opportunities where you don't necessarily have to function to actively erase something anymore. The institutions and the system itself just does it by itself. So it makes it so it's not something that you have to be consciously aware of. And that's, I think, also why Catherine McKittrick and Sylvia Winters say that man is not necessarily referring to a specific body. It's not an individual human. It's an overarching system of knowledge and the cosmological structures that are coded as an innately human story. So I'm not coming at you or anything. I'm just saying as well. Yeah. But yeah, I just want to make that point clear. And then, I don't know, do you want to say something about archive?
Yeah. Not necessarily about archive, but as you said, like the wording erasure comes up continuously. And in the work that I've done in Evra specifically, we see erasure, and it's funny that you say it's also a subconscious thing, as conscious and subconscious. And the conscious would be historically erasing the fact that the Moors existed in Evra. So there's mosques that they just slapped a cross on. And that is the literal erasure by saying this is no longer a mosque, this is now a church. But subconsciously, we still see the images of the Moorish windows, the Moorish architecture all over the city. But you would never really associate that, the historical accuracy. You would think, oh, okay, this is just part of the church. This is some cool designs if you weren't aware of the actual architecture and history. And so that is a really interesting juxtaposition with erasure on the conscious level and the unconscious level. And then that plays into invisibility as well, right? Because we see these, in Evra specifically, like the Black, Brazilian, Roma communities constantly being pushed into these more hidden corners unintentionally, but also very much intentionally. They want to make the city presentable because now it's a World Heritage Site for the European Union, and they want more tourism, and they want more people that don't look like a lot of the people that look like us up here to inhabit this city. They want people to come in and spend money, and that pushes out the people that have traditionally been there and created the foundation for this city and create the culture that has made this city worth living in and interesting, frankly. But I'm gonna end it there.
No, thank you. I think it's it's kind of a great way to wrap up the question in some ways, because I love a case study, because and I love that so many of you offer case studies. In the case of the wall, part of the aliveness, if you will, is that it's made and unmade. So the same practitioners who produce it are the ones that produce its erasure. Sort of on their own terms. Literally, the archive of it that we have, the one last piece, is there because one of the makers took it down. So I think these are related. And that gets me to another question. I think, Magda, it allows us to maybe start with you, but to bounce it out to others. Let's think about another kind of tension that's used both theoretically, semantically, and I think that is also there in all of your posits again, that between aliveness and stillness. So whether, Janelle's case of a kind of a living, alive, if you will, monument, the way, Magda, you're sort of dealing with, less than alive space, in a way, the cemetery. Just how do you negotiate, and what is the significance of that sort of the notion of something that is living, alive, that needs to be taken care of and stewarded in those unique ways, and something that is more quiet, still, dormant, like a work of art, and that produces art objects like those at the cemetery, a figuration in a flat painting, if you will.
Okay, thank you for the question.
Yeah.
It was a very interesting part of our work. The first edition for us was a very, very strange way to stay in the cemetery, and we didn't know how the people react. But the interesting was that people loved that we colors the part of the cemetery because they believe that colors is good for the death and for the bad spirits in the cemetery. And I think is always in common in our case that there is a very strong intention of community to create some collective memory with an apparently ephemeral way, like art or installation or actions, but is a way to create a new collective memory and a new collective heritage, so cultural heritage. So I think this is very interesting because it's like a way to create a memory in the contemporaneity age, and to rescue some, in our case, some traditions, some cults of minority in a country. So it's interesting because there is the stories, the memories, the collective actions, and the ephemeral that is not ephemeral. So, yes.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Thank you. I think in relationship to the street murals painted directly in the street, this question of aliveness and stillness is really essential, because when you heard Hannah and Kevin talking about that, I mean, what happened with the DC mural is it became still in some ways. It was essentially a disruption in the beginning. It was meant to shake up space and cause a kind of friction, and eventually it ceased to cause that friction. And then many people saw it as losing its original meaning. But what we see in other cities where the murals really erased away over time, they were just driven over, or maybe they were paved over, they were purposely erased by city governments in some cases. But there's still an aliveness that continues, because in every city we go to, we find that other artists are inspired by that mural or shaped by that mural to respond to it. Maybe they didn't like it and they want to do something completely different. That happened in Philadelphia, for example. Or maybe they wanted to build on it and expand the message. So there's always a kind of aliveness that happens, maybe not in that space where the street mural was, which was essentially best seen by drone, actually, but it happens on walls and other spaces, so that aliveness might continue beyond the original form of the street mural itself.
Can I add to that, Heather? Just an anecdote. I remember when we were speaking with an artist in Minneapolis, and that's where we're from, Minneapolis, St. Paul, in Minnesota. And that mural no longer exists either. And we were saying to the artist, who happens to be a visually impaired artist, we were like, it's really disappointing that the one here in our city where this all started doesn't exist anymore. And she said, no, it exists. We're talking about it right now, and that makes it exist. And as long as we talk about it, it will always exist. And so like that was sort of the beginning of thinking like, they can't erase these things. They fade away, but they don't go away, And so that's really a big sort of impetus behind our project.
Yeah, and it's also that tension of visible and invisible. It's in memory. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think for George Floyd Square being a living memorial, I mean, during the uprising, every morning, I would get up so I live like 3 blocks away. And I get up at 6 a.m. and I tend to the memorial. I was giving like 6 to 8 hours of my day to the memorial. And every day it looked different. People would come, they would move things around, they would place things where they needed them and wanted them to be placed, what they felt was most important to be seen or what they wanted others to be seen. Sometimes it was just extroverts being extra. But that's what made it a living memorial, a living space as people continue to come. And so we as a neighborhood, as a community, as we tend to this space, we have accepted this reality that as people come and still come from all over the world. I met a lady the other day. She was on her way to some trip, was in Minneapolis for a layover, hopped off the plane, came to George Floyd Square, and was like, show me where everything is. And even her presence keeps the space a living space because she adds to it. Every person who comes, they add their mark to this protest and to this memorial.
Mm-hmm. Love that.
Yeah, sorry, I'm not sure if this is an answer to your question, but when I think about this question generally, what strikes me, I think, is what is alive and then this notion of stillness, right? And so I think as Black people, we've flipped from both sides of that dichotomy and that binary, which I think it's kind of unconstructive in some ways, because we, as I put on the slave auction block, we've been transformed into still matter, something that wasn't able to speak, something that wasn't able to give a perspective, something that was rendered unalive, and then to now be, I mean, more or less on the other side of it, and to be acknowledged as human, to be acknowledged as alive to the varying degrees in which we are. I think it's interesting to think about those dichotomies and how we still perform them and how they're still being discussed. And so I'm not sure if it's necessarily an answer to the question that you asked, but more so maybe a provocation of how we think about those binaries as not necessarily being constructive in the way that we ask these questions today.
Absolutely, and that's, a lot of what I'm doing is tracking on some of the discourse that y'all have brought up. So this is Harvey Young's notion of stillness, right? Yeah, so just kind of paying attention to Sharp and to Young and to other Hartman discourse, which could be another question, but we don't have all that much time. But it is fabulous that is being dredged up and called into the production of memorial making so actively. I did not expect that. But this discourse of Black cultural studies as they meet visual studies and the sort of language and semantics of that as a way to fasten some of this. Did you have something? No. Yep.
Yeah, I was just going to follow on that. I think that one of the ways that that historically we responded to this is through our Black expression, right? Like what we spoke, what we made, what we sang, what we shared, what we ate. All of these things are ways to respond and to show our aliveness, right? And so the art is a part of that as well, right? In every sort of aspect of it.
Mm-hmm. I think we have time for one more question. We have time for questions from the audience. Let's do that. Does anybody have anything? I can't see. Oh, I do see something. Yeah.
I just have a question for Janelle. You had mentioned that there is such power and importance in not accessing or getting funds from the structures which are the reason why you're protesting. I'm interested in how you go about accessing funding and support for the projects you're doing, especially when the labor is so immense, and how are you caring for yourself and others in that while not accessing the funds which would normally make that more obtainable, yeah.
That's a little quiet.
We'll just switch. Okay. That's a very important question. So yes, we do not take government funds. In the beginning of the uprising, it was just community rooted, people giving, passing the plate. My friends, I used to live in California. My friends held a fundraiser for me, like an art fundraiser, and they brought all of their artist friends and they passed the plate and they funded me with $8,000 to say, go into your community and just do whatever you need to do. And so the beginning of the uprising was just people sharing and giving out of their own pockets. Then as we started to form the George Floyd Global Memorial, that created an opportunity for private foundations to be able to fund us. So the McKnight Foundation is a huge funder for us, Henry Luce Foundation, Wayfair Foundation. And so these foundations that have taken a stand for justice and equity themselves to say, let's pour into the people who are doing the work, boots on the ground. And so we're so grateful for those kinds of partners. But we don't take funds from every foundation because there are some foundations who are partnering with city governments in a way that are undoing equity and justice within the community. So we're actually extremely strategic because it's important to understand where your money comes from. how we care for ourselves and taking care of each other. We, like anybody, we rely on our families, we rely on each other as a community. We have a community group chat where we've had it for 4 years now. It's called Fast Asks. If you need something, put it in the group chat, and if somebody has something, they'll share it with you. Mutual aid is a huge part of our community. The People's Closet is a bus shelter because the buses had to stop running because we blocked off the streets. So we repurposed the bus shelters, and 2 of them became 24/7 clothing donation operations. And one of my neighbors, who's a fashion designer by trade, she oversees the People's Closet. So people will, on their way to work, drop off a bag of clothes, neighbors will come and hang them up, and other neighbors will come and take what they need. And so mutual aid is a huge part of how we sustain the economics of our community, but also by generous foundations and then just people giving out of their own wealth or poverty as well.
Is another question?
This question is for Jack, actually. Or is it Johnny? Wait, am I mixing up? Oh, Johnny. This is for Johnny. Sorry. One of your slides, the auction block, and I didn't know in terms of the slide order when you were speaking. What's the location of that image?
Let me just pull it up really quickly so I can answer that question.
Or of the object. And we're both, there were 2 stones. There was one that was a structure, and then there was a stone next to it. And I was curious if what are they both auction blocks? Okay.
Yeah, so the stone next to it is also another like prompting stone, but the figure is a Green Hill slave auction block photographed by Jack E. Butcher from the Historic American Buildings Survey of 1960. And I got this picture particularly from Catherine McKittrick's Demonic Grounds, in which he references it. And this is from the courtesy of the Library of Congress.
Great, because I know at least one artist who's leveraging the auction block as a type of memorial form. So I think that's a really appropriate question. I think there's another one from the audience.
Hi, thank you all for your very amazing presentations. My question is for any of you. I kind of just want to focus on decolonized, I guess, approaches to success metrics with these type of anti-monument public art projects. So obviously it's more process driven as opposed to producing something more tangible, which colonial approaches to public art very much wants us to focus on. But then in order for some of these art projects to manifest, there does have to be some political buy-in. For instance, like the government owns most of these streets where these huge murals are being painted on. There needs to be like permitting processes that are given, et cetera. But then when that does happen, these projects tend to become tokenistic and then lose the actual essence of why they were even created to begin with. So for any of you, what is a decolonized, successful metric for the success of these projects? Is it the community coming together itself? Is it the act of protest? What does that look like for any of you, or all of you if we have time?
Can I just ask a question also? Do you mean like decolonization, or are you talking about decoloniality, or are you using like the umbrella term for these for this question?
Yeah, it could be the umbrella term. So essentially what I'm getting from most of these presentations is that there are these anti-monumental type commissions are very much taking a decolonized approach to public art commissioning in general. So therefore, what does a decolonized form of assessing the success of these projects look like? Whereas in the other presentations, it was very much, like we talked about the art being as good as like the patron needs it to be. So we're very much focusing on the tangible final success of it. So what does a decolonized form of that look like for these types of projects?
And we had our marker. We've got 3 minutes left, so.
Well, I think I would. So in the case of Black Lives Matter street murals, and everything that you said is correct, right? Like some of the street murals are on the street with permission. Some of the street murals are on the street because people put them there and didn't ask for permission. I wonder if it's the whole idea of success or failure is like the thing that we could sort of decolonize that concept, right? Like if the, as we're kind of arguing that the real sort of value of the murals, partially it's marking space, but it's mostly in the communal acts that create them. People coming together, sharing memory, sharing community, sharing with each other and creating something together, then that's I suppose, the success. But I kind of want to push back on even thinking of it in terms of success or failure, because that is a kind of construct of coloniality itself, So obviously the colonizer or that sort of framework would look at what people who are marginalized are doing and always call it a failure. They would always say that, so what? You painted on the streets, it's gone now. But that's the point where what our experience and our expression and everything that we do together that we remember and pass down through non-institutional means still has power in light of that.
I had that question actually to the panelists from the questions that we pulled together last night, and I asked it because I think it's a valid question if we switch out maybe the word success, as one is saying, but what makes it work, let's say. And so in the case of the wall, I think about this a lot because it does not exist anymore. So you do wonder what happens when these things disappear, and when it takes another 15 years to salvage them from a historical record, nobody knows about them. And so a kind of critical success for that I've written about vis-a-vis this is that people across the street would tell the artists, famous artists from Apricobra, that, for instance, they should revise their image of somebody like Nina Simone. So they would yell across the street to them and say, hey, I don't like the way that looks. I've got to look at it every day. Can you put some more lipstick on her? That kind of thing. So I agree, but I think that then we can actually go deep into our own cosmologies, if you will, and sort of think about what does it mean for it to work, if not succeed, if that's not the word that pops off here. But what makes it so that it is, that we know that it's a viable artwork for a given community. And so I think, that's an example of that.
I'd like to respond, but I think you had a response first. If you want to go.
You can go ahead, go first.
Okay. So, Tada, I thank you for your response, because I was sitting here just racking my mind, I don't understand the question given my context, because nothing is permitted in George Floyd Square. We literally just built everything in the street, and I had a city employee come to me, and she started complaining about the fire pit, and she said, the fire pit is not to code. I said, nothing is to code here. They impounded our guard shacks because we had to do 24/7 community defense because the police weren't servicing our neighborhood. And so we replaced it with fists, 12-foot fists. And so it's just kind of a call and response, and we don't ask permission. We just do it, and the city just understands that they don't have the type of control and power that they want to have over George Floyd Square, because the people are organized. We leverage this idea of property owners in the United States, that property owners have power, and we got our property owners to stand with us to say, no, we have the say. And so when you go to George Floyd Square, there's a huge sign that says, where there's people, there's power. People are our most powerful currency. Which is why I also say that my biggest title is not executive director, it's neighbor, because I am one of the collective. And people over property, again, is so huge. I know it doesn't work in this industry because it's such a ephemeral, object-driven industry, but we told each other as memorial caretakers during the uprising, if our neighborhood burns, which was a real possibility in reality, we said, As memorial caretakers, our job is to run into these houses and keep people from trying to save themselves in their bathtubs or save their property. Like, get people, we had people's cars strategically placed on the outskirts, and we said we will get them away as fast as possible. And if the memorial burns, it burns. Because it's us that we value. It's our stories, it's our collective living, and it's our collective fight for justice and racism that matters more than the property itself. And if the property survives, it lives to tell the story.
Great, thank you.
Can I just hop in really quick?
Yeah, hop in really quick, yes.
Right, really fast. So
We've got good lunch.
I love the idea of people over property, especially when it comes to your question of like decolonizing memorials or monuments. I think it's really kind of important that we kind of like shift away from this idea of like permanence, because that's much more of a colonial thing, empire, like it has to constantly physically be there, versus it exists, it's a form of survival, and it will come and go. Things will change as time goes on, and they'll be reconstructed, as you said, like cosmologically, it'll change, and that's just kind of the way that people who are in these spaces create things. And you wanted to say something really quick. Sorry. Yeah, if I can like just tout really quickly. I just wanted to say that linking to this and this notion of permanence, I think it's also really important that even if the physical or material structure itself is gone, like the narrative of success or working, I think is problematic, as we've discussed already, but it's more so, I think, the focus on survival, and then how those things continue to be, they become ramifications in our community, and those become sociogenic principles, which and then in turn structure these different like cosmological outsets and these different worldings that then we try to like structure going forward, instead of focusing on work, success, and these other normative definitions. But yeah.
Thank you all. Wonderful. Thank you so much.